So I'd like to bring up Sarah McCaffrey, and there we go. Sarah is a social scientist who works all over the United States and has really spent a lot of time thinking about what our actual communities think versus what our perceptions of what communities think. And I think this will help us really begin to understand and tease out where the real challenges are, because they may be a little different than we actually perceive them to be. In conversation with Sarah, we realized we have a commonality, and I'm curious how many people in this room have the same commonality. We both lived through the Oakland Hills fire in 1991, so I'm curious how many people here have lived through that fire. It's so interesting. All right, well, thank you very much, and we look forward to your program.
I guess I need this stuff.
Yeah.
Unless, like the previous speaker, I'm kind of short, so I like to stand in front. So I'm going to talk today about human behavior and what we know about human behavior from social science. And I'm going to start with my triangle, because we like triangles. But I'm going to kind of make a point with my triangle. If we want to learn to live with fire, there's sort of three pieces of information we really need to understand. We need to understand the physical environment, the weather, that sort of thing. We need to understand the ecological environment, and we need to understand the social dynamics. Now, it's worth thinking about what this triangle really looks like in terms of how we talk about things. And you can think about it in terms of the talks you've heard here. We've heard a lot about ecology. Whoops, hold on, I turned it off. There we go. We've heard a lot about ecology. We've heard a fair bit about the physical between weather and climate change. And I also would say physical is a lot of technical. We have a lot of technical solutions where we model things, we create maps. Social behavior. We've heard one great one yesterday about Native Americans and what they did on the landscape and what they valued and how they used fire. Carleone talked a little bit about how you work with communities. So I would argue that this triangle really looks more like this. This is our current triangle that we talk about how to live with fire. And I would argue that this is part of our problem and our dilemma for why we're not moving forward. I've heard a lot of the conversations we've heard today for 20 years now. And to me, that's a problem. And I would argue part of the problem is because we continue to look for technical solutions to the problem. We continue to look for physical solutions. So until we start looking at the social with the same amount of attention to detail, the same amount of research, and the same amount of acknowledgement of the complexity of the dynamics, we are not going to get far. We're going to have this triangle. And the problem with this triangle is when you have fire, it's really, really creaky. And this is the result you get. It tips over and we just end up with the results we don't want. Whereas if you have equal amount to the social as you do to the other two sides of the triangle, you end up with a much more balanced triangle. It's much more stable. You get a fire and you have a much better outcome. So I think if we really want to think about having future better outcomes, we need to start talking about the social beyond simply how do we get people to do what we want them to do casually, and then we turn back to our models and our maps and these sorts of things. If we want to change behavior, we need to understand why people behave the way they do. And I think one of the reasons we default to this sort of better maps, better this, is there's an assumption if we just get the information right. And if we get that information to people, then they're going to make the right decision. That's called the information or the docking. Go give them the information. That's been discounted and disproven since the 1960s. That's not how humans work. Information is important. It is not sufficient to change anyone's behavior. So that's kind of some of the challenges we have about living with fire. And if you think about what is living with fire, well, living, that's a behavior. So if we really want to learn how to live with fire, then we have to understand the behaviors. We have to not default to the technical solutions, and those are desirable, they're easy, we have control over them. Government agencies are much easier to, can do that much better, and there's more consolidated than all these individuals out there. And we need to also step beyond fire in a vacuum. We tend to think about the fire problem and the fire solutions without thinking about the context and the social context in which they happen. So we come up with a lot of solutions that sound great in the fire world, but they never happen, practically speaking, because there's a whole mess of other social contexts going on out there. And I'll talk about just one little example. And we sort of ignore the interconnection of the issues. So there might be consequences to the solution that might actually lead to outcomes that we don't want down the road. And the good news is there's actually a lot of relevant social science research that can tell us about behavior, so we don't have to start from scratch. There is nowhere near as much as there is about ecological and the physical, but there's enough that we can definitely start giving you some answers rather than having to rely on the biophysical scientists to make assumptions and guesswork about human behavior. So I'm going to talk really briefly about two key fields. I'm going to go through this super fast because I'm covering all of social science in 20 minutes. So I'll give you a few examples, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, so please ask me questions or come see me afterwards and I'll be happy to clarify anything. Natural hazards field has been around since the 1930s. Why do we have build dams and levees and we still have flooding losses? So it's looking at why people adopt certain behavior adjustments and why they don't. And what's useful, and then there's also a lot of wildfire social science since 2000. So there's actually a decent body of literature built up, particularly about homeowners and mitigation and public acceptance of fuels treatments. And these are two GTRs that synthesize this work from 2010. There's over 160 articles on the two that I talked about, over 60 studies, and I would say since 2010 that's probably doubled or tripled. So the natural hazards field, basic premise is a natural hazard is just a normal biophysical occurrence that becomes a hazard once it starts impacting something people care about. And so fire is fire, and we wouldn't care about it if it was someplace far away from anything that we cared about. It would just be something that nature's doing. But once it starts impacting societies, they start reacting to it. And there's 4 stages that have been identified. I'm going to go through these quick. The first is loss absorption. Okay, it has an impact, but let's just do something to sort of absorb it. And a really simple example is it starts raining really, really hard, so I get out my umbrella. I'm adapting, so it's not affecting me. But then eventually it's going to start having bigger costs onto society. So you start noticing this is something we probably need to do as a society, but initially it's a pretty basic reaction. Let's figure out a way to absorb these costs so nobody bears the brunt of the burden. And so insurance is a very standard way of handling it. Let's bear and share the burden. And that's the purpose of insurance. It's meant to bear and share the burden. It is not meant to change people's behavior. So that's just a note for thinking about insurance as that great magic bullet that we hope for. Reduction, that's the next one. Once it has significant impacts, we start thinking we better do something about this. We can't afford to just sort of bear and share. And that's called mitigation. And there's 2 stages. One is actively modifying the hazard, and that's called structural, and one is modifying human behavior. And I'll talk a bit more about this, but I want to touch on the 4th, which is complete change. Why do we let anybody live there? Let's not, that sort of thing. That's incredibly rare. It happens only in extreme cases, and it only happens along the margins because basically by the time it gets to this point, there's such a significant societal infrastructure, both in terms of physical infrastructure, in terms of cultural infrastructure, that level of change is like very, very hard to do and very unlikely to happen. So it only will happen at the margins. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about mitigation because that's really the key. That's really where everybody is once a hazard starts having a big effect. Modifying the environment. This is the initial approach. It's let's figure out how we can prevent or modify the hazard so it has less of an effect on it. Move it somewhere, make it less. And so this tends to be often large-scale engineering efforts done by government because they can we'll just go in and take care of it. Levees and dams are kind of the classic example of that, but fire suppression really fundamentally is a structural way of modifying the hazard. We're trying to get rid of it, flat out. But the problem with this type of thing is what it actually tends to do is it just exacerbates the issue. It raises the threshold of an event. So yeah, we get rid of those small events, but we build up conditions so that when we do overwhelm the threshold, the safety factors we put in place, the damage and the event is bigger and more damaging. So when we have levees, we've allowed people to build around in the town of Houston, and we saw what happened in September. When we suppress fires, we're allowing the vegetation to build up. And so when we do have fires, we can't suppress because of the weather conditions. They're just big, worse, and nastier than they would have been if we'd had smaller fires that had led to a patchier landscape. So eventually, you get around to saying, okay, we're not going to be able to engineer our way out of this. We have to modify behavior. We have to have people change their behavior. We have to change the norms and values about the best way to live in this landscape, how to behave, what my house is going to look like, what my landscape is going to look like, that maybe if I'm going to live where it floods, I should be building my house on stilts. And so that can be building codes, it can be regulations, it can be zoning. So in the end, basically, once you have a hazard that has an impact, the odds are pretty good that your final solution is going to be a combination of structural and non-structural approaches. So where do we end up with fire management? Well, many of you, but perhaps not all, might be familiar with the cohesive strategy, which has 3 legs, and this is kind of the national program to have all the stakeholders focus on how they're going to talk about fire management. And the first 2 legs are wildfire response and fuels treatments. And those are both structural approaches to modifying the hazard. And then the final one is fire adapted communities. And that's basically beginning to get at this behavior change, both structural approaches in terms of having fuels treatments, in terms of your ignition resistant homes, but both of those require a behavior change too. So that's kind of where we should be going, based on where we are, based on the fact that we figured out that these structural ones don't work. The problem is, this is where we're stuck. If you think about most of the talks you've heard here today, they've been around fuels treatments. They've been around, let's modify that vegetation. We've had this morning, today, we've had a little bit more around the houses and the structures and what you can do in your community, which is fantastic. But even those, the information that you've heard so far is the structural part of that equation. So that's kind of the takeaway from natural hazards is we actually know about these. The situation we're in is not surprising. It's very predictable based on how societies respond to a hazard. So let's think about what that means in terms of what's the best way to move forward. And in terms of fire social science, the key takeaway from that is we need to be aware of the imagined public or the imagined problem. So there's a lot of narratives in the fire world about what the problem is. It's all these people moving into the wildland urban interface. It's all these new people, a couple other things. And the reality is that when you look at the empirical data, it doesn't support any of these narratives. There's one that I can think of in which it's supported. And why? Why might we have this huge disconnect? There's a couple things going on. One is the narratives can serve a societal purpose for different reasons. But there's also this idea of like when we talk about information changes behavior, well, that's based on the assumption that people's, behave entirely kind of like I have, basically like artificial intelligence. I got this information, that means I need to behave that way, therefore I will. But the reality is the way our minds work, and as Dave talked about, probability, for instance, is really complicated. So we use a lot of cheat sheets in our mind, heuristics, rules of thumb, and they also are kind of talked about as biases to simplify these processes. So 2 biases that come into play in this are sampling bias. So we take a small non-representative sample of people and what they think, and we say this is the entire public. So we take the people who come and complain about a certain thing and say, complain about a prescribed fire, and that equates to no one likes prescribed fire. Confirmation bias is related. It's basically once we form an opinion about something, we tend to discount information that contradicts it and give more value and pay more attention to information that reinforces it. We all do this. We can think about our politics. That's very common. But it also means with fire, if you think this is the problem, you're going to be like, see an example that supports it. You're going to be, see, I told you no homeowner is doing any defensible space. Or if you think homeowners are engaged and really great, you're not going to notice the houses that don't have defensible space. So we basically have these mental traits that allow us to maintain our narrative that suits us, despite what the data might actually say. So I'm going to very quickly talk about 3 issues that empirical research show us and what the data shows to give you an idea of this. And just for those of you who think prescribed fire, you can't do it. This is a prescribed fire in Incline Village, Nevada. No one complained. In Incline Village, all those dots are homes worth millions of dollars. Okay, risk perception, that's a really common one. If we just give better risk information, if they understood the risk, well then they'd have to do something. So if they're not doing anything, they must not understand the risk. Well, there's lots of work in natural hazards and the risk analysis that sort of says, risk is a really complicated topic. It's also incredibly subjective. So risk, the classic definition, and here's a good example. David gave you a definition of fire risk that was not this definition. So you might even be using different definitions of risk. But the kind of classic example often used in the literature is probability of an event times the negative consequences. So that already introduces a whole mess of places where we can come to confusion and contradictions in talking about different risks. What's the spatial extent of the risk I'm talking about? What's the time frame I'm talking about? What's the negative consequence? So if you ask a homeowner, what's your risk? They're probably thinking, what are the odds that my home is going to burn down from a fire in the next 10 years? Firefighter, what's your fire risk? What are the odds I'm going to be on a fire where houses are threatened this year? Those are two very fundamentally different risks. Or you might say, what's fire risk? And one person immediately goes to home loss, and another person immediately goes to concern about habitat loss for a particular species they care about. So we might all be talking about risk, but we might not all be talking about the same risk. And then the other part of it is how we respond to risk is highly variable. It's about our personality. So personality trait of a risk attitude. So some people are very risk tolerant. They think it's really fun to jump out of planes or to jump off cliffs wearing a squirrel suit. That's a good time to them. That's life. There's other people who will not leave their home because they're so terrified of all the risks that are out there. So how we respond to the same risk. So even if you and I agree on the risk, we might actually respond to it very differently based on our risk attitude. And this comes out in, for instance, in this homeowner in Flagstaff who commented, well, yeah, you guys are up in the canopy. You are right there in the canopy. That's one reason we didn't buy up there. I was terrified. So there's self-selection going on. People who are too risk averse to the fire hazard just say, it's not worth it for me to live out there. People who live out in where there's a fire hazard, odds are pretty good. They recognize it. And for a number of reasons, they're comfortable with it. And so that's what we see with research. The vast majority of people recognize that they live in a high-risk area, but higher risk perception doesn't lead to action. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition. You do have to see there's a risk, but that's not going to be enough. Other factors come into play, your risk attitude, trade-offs with benefits. It's really worth it to live out here because I have daily exposure. That's been shown the more the benefits from exposure to a risk, the more you're going to tolerate it. And the best example I have is how many of you drove here in your car? Right? You got here really fast. That was probably the riskiest thing you did today. And probably fairly risky, actually. Individual capacity, do I have time, money? And here's a whole bunch of other narratives that aren't supported empirically. And I'm just going to read them, but I don't have time to explain them. Smoky's taught the public to think all fire is bad. No evidence. Evidence is that most people have a pretty sophisticated idea of fire and they understand that it has ecological benefits. People don't take responsibility. Evidence that it's more of a notion of shared responsibility. We all share the risk. We all have a responsibility to take care of our property. That new or seasonal people don't understand the risk or are less proactive. Evidence on new people is there's none. And the evidence on part-time is that it's just a time issue. Or that fire events are needed to motivate action and prevent complacency. Two things there, simply tons of natural hazards. Experience can make some people proactive. It can make some people actually do the opposite, fatalistic. The vast majority of people, it really doesn't change their behavior. And this notion of complacency drives me bonkers because it just implies that people don't know and they don't care. And the reality is simply that people have incredibly busy lives. And thinking about fire and doing something about fire, they may just have a lot of other things they're doing. And it's not that they're not worried about it. And they're not maybe doing, then they might be doing something, but they're not doing it as much as we want them to do. That doesn't mean they're complacent. So there are three main influential dynamics. Knowledge, the more people understand a practice, the more active they're going to be and the more supportive they'll be of it. The higher the trust they have in the information source or in the people who are implementing the practice, the more they're going to accept it. And then interactive communication is really key. And this is another one that comes from a huge field of social science research on social marketing. How do you get people to stop driving drunk, to wear seatbelts? And basically, if you want to change behavior, you got to have that interactive communication so you can help understand what their issues are. They can understand where you're coming from. They begin to trust you. They can ask questions, build their knowledge base. So adoption of mitigation measures very quickly from natural hazards. The effectiveness of the action is critical. So how much is this going to protect me down the road? What are the odds? That's critical in improving people's outcomes. Ability to undertake the action, do I have time, physical ability, can I get rid of my vegetation? And then other values, competing complementary values. And this again, too often we're focused on fire. Oftentimes people have fantastic defensible space for reasons that have nothing to do with fire. And so find out what those complementary values are. Sometimes it's competing, erosion control. I'd like to take out vegetation, but you know, we have erosion issues. I live on a hill. Social norms, they can be a norm that says we're going to do this, or they can be a norm that's saying we all want our privacy, we're not going to cut it out, but those can be changed. So this is just basically what a basic idea of getting homeowners to mitigate looks like. We sort of tend to assume it's recognize the risk, they'll act. No, recognize the risk, they'll seek information about, well, what are my options to do this mitigation? What's the level of risk? What's my risk attitude, my experience? All of those go into play in deciding, well, maybe I should do something, but that doesn't mean they do something. Then they go into a trade-off analysis in which they look at what's the response efficacy, do I have the ability to do it, what are all these other things that come into play? And if this comes out to be positive, then they will take action. And if it doesn't, they won't. But the good news is, that's a long list of things, and there's a place where you can find a point of leverage and maybe change something. It may be as simple as helping them get rid of their vegetation. And very quickly, evacuation decision-making, because I know that was something here. Natural hazards field, people don't panic. That's kind of this myth that we've had that's been discounted in the natural hazards field since the 80s. In fact, people try to normalize the event. They seek information, confirm what they're doing, and then they actually, the bigger issue is probably reacting too slowly. And in terms of research findings, response efficacy really matters for fire, like how effective is evacuation going to be at saving my life? They're more likely to leave early. One of the questions is people who think preparedness, mitigating around your house is more effective are more likely to stick around longer. So that's kind of a question. People pay attention to different cues as triggers to leave. Everybody pays attention to the official cues, but well over the majority also pay attention to physical cues. So official cues matter to everybody, but a huge percentage are also going to be looking at smoke and flames and those sorts of things for their trigger. So it's one thing to come up with triggers to act for the authorities to issue the warning. The assumption that the moment we issue the warning means everybody's going to respond to it is not going to hold up. And risk attitudes really matter. People who are really risk tolerant are more likely to wait around longer. People who are more financially risk tolerant are more likely to evacuate. So finally, just to summarize, improve outcomes, we need to shift from this sort of default response of focusing on the structural modification solutions and the biophysical solutions and knowledge to sort of, let's give equal weight to understanding the complexities of human behavior. We don't have to reinvent the wheel though. We already have a solid base of information that we can start from, both in terms of knowledge, and as Carleone said, there's some fantastic programs out there. Just find them and modify them for your local context. And so it's going to require us to continually assess the narratives that we say about the problem, the narratives that we say about the solution. Do we have the right data for this? Does it support our narratives? Does it support the solutions we proposed? And thinking creatively and beyond the fire vacuum, because we can learn a lot from other fields, but we can also, I think ahead about how our solutions might have unintended consequences that might actually not get us to where we want to be. That's it. And one quick thing while I have the mic. If you don't know about Tree Search, you should. Tree Search is a database where you can download for free any Forest Service research publication. And it's very good. It's actually very easy to use. You can search by author names, you can search by subject topic, and then you can just download the PDF. And it's fantastic. I don't say that about a lot of databases. And these 3 GTRs summarize a lot of what I've talked about today.
That's great. We'll leave that one up. Okay, we have time for a couple questions directly to Sarah, if anyone has a question. We'll have a discussion later, obviously, too.
Sarah?
The easy one.
Yeah. I'm really curious about so this concept of sort of authentic communication.
No, you have to pull it out actually to turn it on, I think. It's kind of down toward the bottom.
There we go. So I'm really curious about this concept of, you know, the trusted source, how we deliver the information. We don't just come and dump information, but it's, you know, based on listening and being a part of the community and making sure that we are providing reliable information that people can then verify and then move to that implementation framework. Is there any rules of thumb in that process that can help that process be more effective besides what I just said?
Yeah, in a short time frame. So in my on the page that I trust, there's actually a photo of a guide about how to build trust and what we know about trust and processes you can use. So that would be the simplest way to get information comprehensively. But the way I like to think about trust and trust building at a basic level is more how I hear people talk about it. I don't hear people talk about trust directly. I mean, trust is like competence, credibility, transparency. Those are all important factors for trust. But to me, it's about respect. So what I hear people say is, I respect the expertise of fire people, and I want them to help me understand. And I am not trying to tell them to do their jobs, but in return, I want my desire to be informed and my desire that I have concerns and to know that they're being taken into account, to be respected. So it's kind of, to me, a lot about trust is the mutuality about it, is that we need, if we all respect each other's point of view and are willing to listen to it and the expertise, that goes a long ways towards the trust.
Great, thanks a lot.